You are listening to MSP 1337. I'm your host, Chris Johnson, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today. First and foremost, I'd like to thank our sponsor, MSP-Ignite. MSP-Ignite offers a peer group experience that is unique to managed service providers in the technology industry. If you are serious about implementing a model for success through sharing and collaboration of best practices, this is the best way to do it. Head on over to msp-ignite.com to get more information. All right, on to the show. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of MSP 1337. I'm your host, Chris Johnson. And again, this week, I am joined by Eric Hanson of Inland Productivity Solutions. Welcome, Eric.
Thanks for having me back on, Chris.
Hey, so this week, as we have since the beginning of November, we've been talking about how does an SMB managed service provider, or sorry, I should say a managed service provider that really focuses on the SMB space, how do they get started? We talked about frameworks that make sense based on that are kind of focused on what MSPs are doing that really help you identify and align with security controls. We've talked about pre and post boom. What are the products and services that are in the room that help us identify to the degree that we're protecting? And then, of course, as you put it so eloquently, post boom, which is what are we doing now, right? How do we respond, recover, and prevent going forward? So as I was thinking about continuation through the month of November, I had some thoughts around what is sort of the next step for an MSP who's gone from trying to get their program off the ground to a state where they can confidently say, I'm not just worried about what I'm doing in my own environment to be secure, but now what am I doing sort of client facing? And that's where I reached out to you and said, hey, maybe we need to talk a little bit about how do we overcome some of the objections that a lot of SMBs might come up with as a result of the unknown. Not that they're saying that you aren't doing a good job with them or that you aren't doing certain things, but the reality is what we used to say was antivirus is definitely installed on all the workstations, and they understood what that meant to a degree, is now asking questions around things like XDR and EDR and all these other acronyms that define next-gen technologies, specifically in the cybersecurity space. And real quick, before I have you answer, I got to throw this out there. There was a recent study done by the Ponemon Institute that was talking about what our current prospective clients are now considering. And 93% of the client base that was surveyed, or prospect base that was surveyed, said they would move to a new MSP if they had a clearly defined cybersecurity program. I thought that was pretty interesting. And there were even those that were interviewed. So of the interviewed, 83% of those that don't currently have an MSP said that they would consider adding an MSP to the equation if they had a clearly defined cybersecurity program. So as we talk about overcoming objections, I thought that was really interesting that as we're working towards this path of how do you get going on this program, I would argue starting is way ahead of a lot of other MSPs.
Well, yeah. And I'm not saying that their survey is statistically inaccurate, but boy, those numbers are awfully high. They're awfully high.
That's kind of what I thought too for the survey of one that they did.
I mean, how many people did they survey? How big were the organizations that they surveyed? Because I guarantee you go down the street to the guy who's got five users down the street. It's like, cyber what? Is still, where they're at. He didn't say, oh yeah, let me hire on this expense that I've never ever had.
I would say that there's one key takeaway from this though, because it says the right cybersecurity services. So I think that's kind of that tag at the end.
Yeah.
That right services are really important. And I think that's where you and I were talking about this. We don't have to have all of the cybersecurity gaps filled to be successful providing security services. And again, this is where I thought it was a good idea to have this conversation, especially when we were talking about, a week or so ago, we were talking about the pre and post boom, and we were specifically referencing how Huntress solves some very significant challenges. Not that they're the end all be all, but the point was like, how do I put something like that in the equation where it has low cost to me, high potential benefit to both myself and the client? And I think that's the focus I want to have today is there are the overcoming of obstacles or overcoming objections is where I think you and I have worked together over the years and seen some pretty good ones that just didn't make sense. Like, it's not my budget. Why? Because, well, we don't have a category called cybersecurity.
Right. Well, because that wasn't a thing last year, but guess what? It's a thing now. It was sort of always a thing. It was just not a thing that small and medium
really can't get around that. We really can't get around that, right? Like, this is no longer like, hey, do you think this is going to go away anytime soon?
Yeah. Well, your insurance company has kind of decided it's a thing.
They might go away from you pretty soon.
Yeah. They may decide that they don't want to play. They're going to pack up their sand toys and go home.
So let's start with objections. I'll give you an objection, and maybe I think actually you already said it. So I'll just repeat the objection you said, which was you go down the road and they're like, cyber what?
Right.
You've been there before. I have been there with you before. So let's start with that one on the overcoming objection.
The cyber what objection?
Yeah.
Why on earth do I need this?
Exactly.
You know,
it's going to happen anyways.
Right. I mean, unfortunately, it turns into a storytelling to them. You know, hey, you know, you've got to convince them one way or the other.
Sure.
That, hey, this is an actual risk. So if your organization has never had or I almost hesitate to say organization, if your small business has never had a security breach or never had a security breach of any significance, and you don't know anybody in your circle of,
sure,
you know, maybe you're a business owner, and I'm shocked at how many business owners I talk to that don't talk to other business owners. It's like, how the hell do you do this?
Especially when it's industry specific, right? Like, I'm not saying like you should go talk to a tile guy if you're not even in the construction business at all, but you would at least want to talk to somebody else who's also in the same space you are to have. How do you learn better practice than what you're doing today to say, make more money?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would argue that our industry has evolved a long ways past where a lot of other
fair point
industries have, but which is kind of surprising because, you know, we all think that we have the little bag of secrets that I'm carrying on my back, and I must not allow you to see my bag of secrets.
Right. And then you find out that it's the same secrets that everybody else is carrying on their back.
Yeah, we just package it a little different way. But anyway, getting back to the actual question at hand, the actual objection we're trying to handle. I mean, unfortunately, at that point, it's an explanation. Hopefully you can get a why in there to go, you know, fortunately we've had some big enough exploits that people are aware of what cybersecurity is. You know, they know what Colonial Pipeline is. They know what RBS is. They know what the target breach is. The problem is for these really small organizations is they don't think that's them. So now you have to find a local connection. Almost.
Well, I think that one of the things that we have going for us that adds credibility on the story side is when we had some of these recent breaches like Colonial Pipeline, the beef, I don't remember the name of the company, but you know, you're telling me that A, I can't get gas, and B, I can't get steak. Like, you made that personal. That's attacking me personally. I don't care about work. You just took my dinner away. The story, I think, to your point about we don't talk to our peers in the industries that we're in or other industries. Maybe that is problematic. I don't know that we can change that one, but I also don't think that's the only hurdle, or sorry, the only way to get through to the client, right? Because I think we can say we can be the story, right? Because I think we've got enough MSP models to say, hey, I had a breach happen with me or one of my other clients. Here's what we've done to mitigate that. We would like to take that challenge, what we've learned from that, and apply that here. Does it cost more money? Yes. But here's why we put it in play. Not because we think you are some special company that deserves to not have to need this because you're so special, it will never happen to you, but because it did happen to somebody else and not you. So don't let that happen to you, right?
Well, yeah, nobody's the security snowflake where you're not going to get attacked, unless, of course, you've air gapped your system from the internet.
So I would argue that that's an interesting one. I actually had a client when I was in my early 20s before I realized that I wasn't ready to try and be an MSP as a solopreneur. They had their accounting department that the only time they actually connected to anything outside of that room was when they processed payroll across the dial-up modem. And the only reason that I was able to get in there and actually have an impact on change is when I pointed out to them that all of the files and documents that they were using to process payroll, they were bringing in from the other room on a flash drive. And because the machines that they were putting it on weren't getting updated on their antivirus scanning, there was no way to ever ensure that that flash drive would have been safe because the database engine wasn't being updated on the machines they were bringing the flash drive to. One of the most difficult conversations I've ever had was because of that. And they literally it was disbelief that could happen. But you got to kind of give them some, kudos for trying. I mean, that's a security through obscurity, right?
Yeah. Yeah. But, and that goes back to the thing we were talking about before we actually started recording was, security is not a finite thing. I can't go, I mean, I guess I could go, yeah, you buy this thing, you're good, Mr. Customer. That's just not a thing. And getting people to get to that mindset is a little different. I buy a car and, assuming that I remember to change the oil and put fuel in it.
Right.
Or, if it's electric, remember to charge it and still do the maintenance things. That thing that I bought
right
doesn't have a lot of additional incremental cost where, I give you, here's my security stack. And then a month later, I have to come back and say, that security stack you bought, we need all that stuff. And now we need this extra thing. Not that always, not that necessarily throwing a thing at it is the fix, but look, the world changed.
Yeah.
And as much as you might want to think, well, yeah, but I think I'm good enough. Unfortunately, the world changed and the way that it attacks, somebody comes up with a new attack.
You added a new threat surface that didn't exist before, right? Now we're in the fifth dimension.
Right. But if you can't use that terminology with, with somebody, your attack surface has gotten bigger. What the hell does that mean?
Yeah.
What do you mean my attack surface has gotten bigger? The door is still the same size.
Right. And I think I would take a step back to what you said. You said the security, security isn't finite, right? I think our ability to secure is. Like, I don't think today we can say, we're going to secure to the nth degree and then some. Like, we're like, to your point, like it's going to change tomorrow. We're adding something more, but maybe we're not, right? So I think this comes back to what a lot of MSPs struggle with is understanding what is your client's risk. Because if we know what the risk is, then we may have a current set of criteria, security controls that we need to act upon that are finite, right? So like, while the threat surface might change, what we're trying to protect probably is relatively finite. How we protect it is going to always be changing. Just like you went from, 20 years ago, you probably didn't know very many people that had electric cars, right? But today, that's a pretty common occurrence. They have two completely different models for being refueled. right? And we even had problems there, right? So like one of the draws to buying an electric car was, you can charge it at your house, no big deal, doesn't make the meter, roll too crazily. And then when you're driving across country or to the grocery store, you plug it in and you refueled on someone else's electric grid, dime. Well, now that's changing too, right? Like the free plug-in at Hy-Vee or wherever the grocery store is may no longer be free in the near future. So now what? Does this cost factor into your new plan because you have this electric car? That I think is where I am seeing a lot of pushback, is this lack of understanding to what you said, but I just spent $5,000 on X for security and you're asking for more. And I think that the real point isn't that you are asking for more, it's that they need more. Whether they get it from you or someone else isn't the problem. And in fact, if they were to say, well, I can go down the road and they don't cost as much, that's fine, as long as they're including the same things that I'm proposing that you need to be better off than you were yesterday.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, we had a very small customer, but they're nice people and we help them out. It's the one where if you use the strict MSP,
fire them because they fall in that category.
Well, yeah, fire them because they're too small.
Yeah.
I'm not the guy who does that.
I hope everybody listening is not one of those that does that, because that is much a contributing to the problem as it is fixing the problem.
Right. Well, absolutely. So, they had somebody else come in and scratch at the door with, hey, here's this great deal. I'm like, send me over what they're going to do. And I got it. And I'm like, I won't do that. There's too much risk for me. Because if you have a problem, you're going to come back to me.
And I don't want that problem.
Right. And that's a problem that I know we could mitigate.
Right.
And that we are currently mitigating. And if you decide that you're going to go do this thing that's going to save you $100 a month, is it really going to save you $100 a month? This MSP contract is going to charge you by the hour, and the hourly rate, I can't hire a body and pay insurance.
Sure.
At that rate. There's no way they can provide this service in a competent way.
Well, this is an interesting arena that I think is quickly filling up with contestants. And I would argue that is what is being outsourced versus what is being done in-house. And depending on what is being outsourced, you may be incurring another risk altogether. And that's where I've seen quite a bit, where it's like, we're considering, MSP down the street and they're cheaper than you are. And they may truly be able to deliver as good of product that you can, but there's a caveat. Where are those resources doing the work from? And is that going to work for you, Mr. Client, that says, oh, this is great and beautiful. The 7 of us that are part of the supply chain for the DoD, this is going to save us tens of thousands of dollars, only to find out they can no longer bid on DoD contracts because they can't meet FedRAMP. FIPS encryption isn't capable of being certified because it's all WYSIWYG behind the scenes. And now they're coming back to you. And now you're like, oh, I'm charging you more money than when you left. And it doesn't have to be bad things happened.
Right. Well, and we've done that.
Yeah. I think everybody has at least one story of someone that came, I don't want to say crawling back, but maybe you got an apology or like, hey, you were right. I've seen them be as many as 2 and 3 years because of contracts before they come crawling back or come back, very willingly. Let's shift gears for a minute. I want to talk about, I think there's probably 4 or 5 things that were considered traditional MSP services that are no longer enough. So like one example would be if I think about vulnerability management as a term to use with your client, which used to be, hey, we do patch management. Like, have you had that conversation? Because I think when we talk about patch management, it's easy to go because it's patching all of the things that you're vulnerable for that we know about, which is not the same thing as vulnerability management. Are you running
Right.
into that? I mean, because this is
I think that the average small business customer is not sophisticated enough to understand the difference. They think that, well, if you're doing your patches and updates, you're good. But let's talk about Print Nightmare. Let's use
right.
that as an example.
Oh boy, I think the outcome was worse than the actual threat in some cases.
Well, yeah, I mean, sometimes
to the SMB, right? Like I can't print. I got an
update.
Oh
yeah, I got an update and all the printing's broken, and because of drivers or whatever. I mean, we had it happen on our own network. We had to rip printers completely out and completely redeploy them because the driver was cranky with the latest patch. So, but vulnerability management says, well, I don't have a patch I can apply for that, but I have a way to mitigate the risk. You might prefer to shoot yourself in the foot, but I have a way to mitigate the risk.
Right. As long as I run faster than you, I'm not really worried about the bear.
Right. And the need for that and the need to be able to do the analysis to understand the risk is another thing.
I think that's a really big loaded word. That's one of those 5-letter words that 4-letter 5-letter. I've also been working on my math skills. That's another one of those terrible 4-letter words that we're probably going to get explicit for this podcast because we use the word risk. Right. I mean, is it not like no one wants to hear that? And more importantly, MSPs don't want to bring up that conversation because to get the business that you're talking to have a risk conversation, in a lot of cases, they haven't even had one internally, let alone now have one with you, the third party that's proposing, we're going to build a portfolio around the service offerings to you based on what your risk actually is.
Right. But I mean, at the end of the day, you have to have that conversation because the risk to our customers that have compliance.
That's okay. It was blank.
Our customers that have compliance problems,
right?
Their tolerance for risk is very different than those that don't have those compliance problems, whatever framework of compliance they live in.
Yeah, and I think some of that gets more into, and this is kind of the next one I wanted to bring up, which was, how do you sort of position things like cyber awareness training? Like, this is getting into that risk reduction by helping make sure that everybody is aware of those actual risks that they have to their company, to their business, to the things that are their customers. And they're not getting cyber awareness training from random third parties, right? Like very rare have I run into an SMB who's like, oh yeah. And even in the ones that are regulated, those are my favorite, especially when it comes to healthcare. They're like, oh, we do our annual training. And I'm like, right. But your ability to remember that is about 3 to 4 weeks. So you're saying that once a year you do the training and your entire organization after about 4 to 6 weeks has little to no recollection of the training that they went through because it's been that long. So my new phishing campaign is going to work out great because I've given it just enough time to know that I will get somebody with this little phishing test. Hey, we had to take a brief intermission there because in the real world, even if it's podcast time, you have to do security during the podcast. So after that brief intermission, we're back. And so it was good timing because this is kind of the shift in wrapping up kind of the conversation. This will probably be what I consider probably the biggest part of the discussion, because I think this is where we have the most opportunity for impact on overcoming objections, and that is data privacy or data privacy protection. So whether you're using the CIA, the confidentiality, integrity, accessibility as part of how you present this to a client, the conversation is always about what's important to your client. This is that risk conversation, right? So if we think about the data that they are responsible for, this should open up, I'm not going to say all the doors, but this should be where you can go, hey, gap, hole, opportunity, and have it be really meaningful, because odds are your client is not in the business of sharing all of their secrets with anybody that might want to ask, right? And so the last thing they need is for the threat actors to get in there, exfiltrate their data and say, hey, I want $1 million so we don't share this with the rest of the world. With that in mind, Eric, what's kind of an approach that you guys have taken that helps the client understand that this isn't about how great are the locks or how much more can we spend on locks to protect what's behind it? It's about, do you know what's behind the door that you need to be protecting? Because it's probably not the same in all the rooms.
Right. Right. So, I mean, this goes back to, I think, a problem that, at least in small and medium business, has been a problem forever.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we had, back in the day, cool, we got this new networky thing, and now everybody can share stuff in the company. And you have so many organizations that kind of grew up with, oh yeah, just everybody has access to that network share. Okay, cool. And then that got maybe gets moved to SharePoint or some other cloud-based file storage, and the security review was never done. So there's, I'm amazed at some of the stuff that we'll find when we, go and start looking. It's like, why is there this spreadsheet that's got everybody's social security number and name and address in it? Oh, well, that's just really convenient for HR.
Yeah.
Are you aware that everybody in the company can see this? Oh yeah, but we trust everybody. It's like, you do until you don't. But guess what? When the person that you trust makes an error, and now that becomes available to the bad guys, and the person that you trusted, you trusted them because, it's cool if they see that information. But they didn't really need access to that information.
Well, this is the Microsoft conversation, because if you go back in time, what was the default configuration? And heaven help you if you made the shares be restricted at the root level very far, because you end up locking yourself out of the folders back in the day. So that wasn't a recommended procedure in the first place. Obviously that's changed more recently, but heaven help you.
I wish they just would have done a better job of copying what Novell did, 30 years ago.
Thank you. But to the point, your conversation with an SME is like, well, that's not what Microsoft recommends. Who are you? Right? It's easy to find that.
But the SMB doesn't really know what Microsoft recommends. All they know is it works or it doesn't.
Well, I mean, it depends on how much shadow IT it was before you got involved on, I set up these folder shares. And what do you mean I did it wrong? I followed Microsoft's wizard. The wizard walked me through this. How is it that this isn't good enough? Because again, if they're talking to you and it's after the fact on these folder shares, odds are they didn't want you in the room because it costs money to have you help them set up those folder shares.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, yeah. Well, I mean, I went through this conversation with a prospect on Thursday, they're like, hey, yeah, we bought this server and we want you to help us migrate it. And I'm like, okay, well, what about this and this and this and this? Well, why do we need to think about that? Because you needed to be thinking about that, 5 years ago, but you didn't. Right. And now we got this project. Let's think about that. And, as we go backwards in their conversation, he's like, well, yeah. And we start talking about backup. He's like, okay, so what are you guys doing now? Oh, well, we back it up to a hard drive. I'm like, okay, that's terrifying. And where's the hard drive? Well, it's attached to the server. Okay, that's even more terrifying.
More so, I was good with your NAS device a little bit because it was better than that, but warm fuzzy, no.
Yeah, but then it turns into, oh, well, and then the really important stuff. I'm like, wait a second. What do you mean the really important stuff? What does that mean?
Important to everybody to get their job done, not important.
No. It's important to this one person because that's his project.
Oh, sure.
And if this project goes wrong, well, we have liquidated damages. I'm like, okay, and what does that cost you? Well, that's I think $20,000 a day. Like, So that's the stuff that's really important, and nothing else is really important. Well, no, everything else is okay. So you got to start thinking about this differently.
So this gets into that whole data classification challenge that most businesses have, and I think this is a huge opportunity for the MSP to say, look, I'm not going to tell you what of these three categories you need to classify your information from, critical, kind of important, to it could be public and I really don't care. Then within that, we can help you define what those data types are. Because if you tell me that I'm looking at a folder that has nothing that's confidential, and I'm looking at this going, I see social security numbers, I see financial credit card data, those kind of things, then I can help you understand, like, this is why this needs to be classified in that confidential folder, not it's okay to be in the public folder, right? Because they don't have that piece figured out. They just don't. And it's a huge opportunity, I think, because this is an area where we can say, look, you're right. To your point about the hard drive, or whether it's attached to the server, or the frequency in which it's backed up and where it's backed up, can be different based on the data that needs to be protected. Or if it's regulated, hey, these two projects have CUI data. This isn't going to go to whatever cloud backup storage that can't meet FedRAMP requirements or whatever it might be that you need to pull off. But that doesn't mean you can't have everything else going there, that, the 100 gigs of data or the terabyte of data that you need to back up a certain way. Well, let's not put everything there and spend the money that you had to just for that one chunk of data. And I think that's hard, right? Because it's like, from where I'm sitting as the MSP, if I was an MSP right now, I don't want to have to deal with like X data goes here and Y data goes there. But at the same time, I got to
manage 3 or 4 different backup.
But at the same time, there's a cost factor too. So like if the cost changes drastically, but the value of service is high, I can change what I'm charging for that small management fee change. And neither one of us is, say, hemorrhaging dollars to make it happen.
Yeah. But I think you have to look at it from the bigger picture perspective too. If you have, since we're kind of going down a backup road here.
Yeah.
I have this backup and that backup, and they're really of the same resource. And for me to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, I have to use backup A and backup B and put them back together from a disaster recovery perspective and speed to recovery perspective. I think there's a trade-off to be made there. And we actually had a client a couple of weeks ago had a server go down on a Sunday night. In fact, Halloween night, where this thing starts throwing alerts, and it's like, this server's not coming back up. So I call our contact at the customer. I just happened to be the one that got to make the lovely call. Hey, and he's out trick-or-treating with his kid or at a haunted house or something. He's like, yeah, I took your call. Here's what I'm doing. I'm like, well, I can assure you no good comes of a call from me on a Sunday night.
Right.
And, this kind of the short version is we were able to spin it up on the backup appliance, put them back in service. They had, kind of no idea that it had happened.
Right.
I mean, they knew that it had happened, but they couldn't tell from an operational perspective that, hey, this I've got a $20,000 boat anchor sitting here waiting on a capacitor, on a super capacitor.
Right.
But as soon as they didn't really feel an impact, you're getting internal questions about, well, why do we pay these guys this much?
Right.
This is exactly why we pay these guys this much, is because we didn't have any we had no outage that affected service. We continued to work while we had a dead piece of hardware for 2 days because the vendor couldn't figure out how to get the one part that's hard to ship
right
where it needed to be in the 4-hour window it was supposed to get there in.
That gets into that whole it's a failure but not a failure of the end user experience.
Yeah. Yeah, back in the day when you were there shoving tapes in the thing and you were there all night, they knew because they had to hang around there with you.
I was just going to throw out there, you said something about, in the business continuity side of things, it's like, okay, they both live in the same sort of physical space. But as we look at data sharing and where data lives, you just created almost a perfect example of where suddenly cloud services for that file sharing and that data importance suddenly changes the dynamics of what gets backed up where, because now I have, that data leak prevention, and I can sort of containerize data that's not necessarily tied to the server that's running the on-prem radius controller or file server, or a lot of other things that otherwise would have been, let's just say we're backing up 6 terabytes on-prem. And of that data that was on there that has now been moved to the cloud maybe it was 3 terabytes of files. Well, that's now completely different, and we don't have to have that same structure anymore. This is one of those opportunities where you're like suddenly like, hey, you're right. The cost for the backup is significant. We can change your costs and add the layers of security by making that shift for certain pieces, which is both an opportunity and a warm fuzzy to sleep at night, because they can keep working with a server down as it's coming back online, because the things that they need access to often are not I can't authenticate right now, so I can't get to 365 to get to my team drive or whatever it is, which goes back to one important thing. What happens to your business when you can't get to that data, or that data has been, temporarily taken offline? How long can you go?
Right. Well, and that's the, that's a part of the calculus you have to go through with that customer. Okay, how long is too long? And of course,
it's always
the immediate answer is always right.
Yeah.
A 1 minute is too long. Okay.
Until you give them the pen to write the check and tell them that they need another comma in there.
Right. Sign here. Wait. Maybe we can tolerate a little downtime. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Okay. So what does that really look like?
Right.
Is 4 hours too much? Is 2 days too much?
Well, and the time also factors with what data can you actually lose in the event to get back online quicker. Like if we said, hey, we can get you back online in 30 minutes, but you're going to lose all of today.
Right.
Maybe that's acceptable. And that
maybe that's okay.
So the final thing that I wanted to touch on, as we've talked about all of these overcoming objections, and really I think we've mostly talked about getting in the room on one of these components in this overcoming objections. We've been talking about this since I started the podcast. What are the layers of security that we need to constantly be considering as we add layers? So I just want to throw this out there, and I'm not proposing that you go, oh, you need to outsource or you need to do it in-house, or that either one of those matter. I'm not asking for specifics. But as you continue down this path of security services becoming additional layers to your service offering, and we know that this is a sort of infinite level of where you could go with this, what are some of the things that you see that you don't necessarily, in fact, you probably don't do out of the gate with that conversation? But what are the products or services that you go, I need to add and layer this in within a specific time frame? I'll just say that in that first year, because I think sometimes, or a lot of times, there are security layers we could add, but they really don't help until you've gotten the housekeeping and the maintenance model to a certain point for that to be effective.
Right. So for us, we have pieces of our stack that are absolutely non-negotiable.
Yep.
If we're going to onboard you, you are going to do this.
Right.
And I think this is a big thing that we don't often do well in this industry, is explain the why of, we tell people they need stuff. We don't really explain why. And here's why you need it.
And some of it you shouldn't have to, which is sometimes a red flag, not necessarily on onboarding them as a client, but to go, if we're red flagging here, what's the next layer I need to add here real quick? Because the lack of understanding is going to dictate how well we can treat them long term.
Right. Right. So, we have the pieces that are non-negotiable. I think that you have to have some sort of detection backup, obviously, wherever the data is. And so often that's 2 or 3 different backups.
Yeah.
As I just said, I'd like to avoid doing that. The reality is you can't.
You're not,
because if you've got cloud data and local prem data for whatever reason.
But you're not necessarily saying, hey, 2 vendors or 3 vendors, or that it's necessarily a different dashboard. What you're really saying is having the redundancy of backups so that in the event that there's failure, it's not like, yeah, that backup failed, so you're stuck.
Yeah. Well, and additionally, not necessarily that you're backing the same resource up using multiple mechanisms.
Yeah.
But that you understand where the data is.
Yep.
Because,
more importantly, when you restore it, can they get to it because you had to put it somewhere else?
Right. So from the perspective of, okay, Mr. Customer, we've had those situations where, oh yeah, well, Sally was saving this locally on her C drive because she thought it was safer than putting it on the server, or she thought it was safer than right, or she thought it was safer than saving it to the cloud, and then the local storage dies, and yeah, well, Sally, you were mistaken.
Yeah, let's fix the mistaken part. So then let me ask one more. Go ahead.
Oh, so I think it's important to understand where the data that's at risk is.
Yep.
And that and I'm just going through my kind of non-negotiable things.
Right.
Here's, understand where the data at risk is. And then we at least want to be able to detect that that something went bad.
Yep.
And then we can talk about all the additional locks
which raises a really important question that I wanted to ask. So with that, what does it look like for you on non-negotiables from like a compliance or security monitoring standpoint that's probably not part of a traditional stack of MSP tools and solutions, but more of like, I'm going to say this is kind of the new frontier of what exactly are we monitoring for? Where are we monitoring? What are the limitations? Because yesterday I monitored your 365 and all your on-prem stuff, and now you're logging into 9 different cloud applications, and you're mad at me because I didn't tell them that 2FA on 6 of those that weren't turned on is the reason that they were breached.
Right. Well, I think that's a real challenge for us, honestly. We have someone who recently deployed a cloud app, and one of the upfront questions was, okay, is there 2FA available for this?
Yep,
there's 2FA available for this, and the 2FA of it, it is available. It's unenforceable, but it's available,
and you really can't check it to see how well it's been adopted.
Correct. Well, yeah, literally the customers said, well, we have to do this. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to make everybody send us a screenshot that they turned it on. It's like, okay, are you going to make them send you a screenshot when they decided to hit the button, turn it off?
Well, I mean, I think that's a big one too. And I won't go down the rabbit hole of, that vendor evaluation process that goes into 2FA or not 2FA, but what's acceptable once it's been implemented? What is it? Right. I mean, we could argue that something's better than nothing, but what happens when that something is already part of a policy that says this is not acceptable from a security standpoint? Or you get into the whole, once you've done the 2-step verification, you can check the box that says trust device. Well, trust the device for how long? Forever? For 30 days? Because to me, trust device on a device being compromised, that device is trusted.
Right.
If I got into the device,
right. If the device is trusted, the device is then compromised, and we haven't detected that the device is compromised somehow.
And the device is authenticated and has already circumvented the 2-factor authentication.
Right. Right. I mean, and then,
Eric, it's time to go home. It's time to hang up our hat. We just found the crux of all of it, and there is no way that we can truly be secure.
Nothing will ever be truly secure.
No.
That's not true. I know how to unplug the power cord.
I would also say that it's about what is your definition of secure? because when we go out on the ocean with a boat, my definition and your definition may not equate to the same definition, but we both would consider ourselves secure. I would argue that if you don't have enough in your cooler, definitely not secure.
Not secure. I see.
Absolutely.
Well, so long as you have the cooler and the cooler will float and the water's not too cold, you can survive for a while.
We call that a float trip instead of a boat trip. Eric, as always, I appreciate you taking the time out of your day and still performing security functions during the podcast. I commend you for that level of diligence and dedication to your client, as well as to the show. For those of you listening, this is MSP 1337. Thanks and have a great week.
Thanks, Chris.